course, as with many things, once you get a bit of practice, you can break the rules. Smoky. Okay, I'm making this video as a guide on how to solder. I've seen quite a few guides which say something like apply the iron and count to a certain number. And I've also simply seen a lot of people who are very afraid to do soldering, mostly because they seem to be scared of overheating the component, and I think that's the number one thing which leads to bad soldering. From what I've seen is people basically who are so scared of damaging the component that they don't actually manage to solder it properly in the first place. To solder something properly, it's not about following a particular method. You need to look at what's happening. And the main indicator of a good solder joint is when you can see the solder flow, meaning it looks like a liquid and it has surface tension that holds it, sticking it onto the part that you're soldering. If you don't see that surface tension effect, then you haven't soldered the joint yet. Usually that means you need to keep the soldering iron on the part for longer until you see that change of state in the way the solder looks. It's the same whether you're soldering a big component like this RCA connector or something smaller like a IDC connector, a PCB connector, or something really small like little chips on the actual circuit boards. It's the same thing that you're looking for, that change of flow in the solder. Now to start, we tin the iron, so that means putting a little bit of solder on the iron in advance. This helps because when there's a little bit of the liquid solder on the iron, it helps to make contact with the parts you're touching. The soldering iron needs to touch both parts that you're soldering. You can't solder this connector to the circuit board if you're only got the iron on the circuit board, because the part won't get hot. Vice versa, you can't do it if you're only touching the component, because it won't go to the circuit board. You know, if depending on the shape of the part, you might put the iron at a slightly different angle so that you can make sure the tip is actually touching and contacting both the two things that you want to solder. And in this case, the connector has a little hole on this side of the pin, so I'm actually going to flip this around. This way my iron can contact the back of this pin where it's more solid, as well as the circuit board. So on the circuit board and the tip and the pin, and then I'm going to start feeding the solder into the I'm feeding the solder into the junction between the three parts, between the pin, the circuit board and the soldering iron. And as I feed the solder in, you can see it starts to flow around. You can see it's already flowed around here. And you can also see that it's clinging to the pin. If I bring the soldering iron up, you can see it's following the soldering iron and clinging to the surface. Now this is a good joint. You can see that the solder has a smooth shape that fillets between the two parts, between the circuit board ring or pad and the pin of that. Here I've got a power switch and a circuit board I want to solder onto it. So I'm going to wipe my iron quickly. I'm going to start by after wiping my iron, putting a little bit of solder on the iron. When the iron's got a little bit of solder on it, that helps to make contact with the things you're soldering. I'm going to apply the iron to both parts and I'm going to feed the solder in. I'm not going to feed the solder in to the iron because then it just tends to stick on the iron. And you can put the soldering iron on and feed it into the component. Once the component's hot enough, the solder will melt on it. But the best thing to do is actually to put the soldering iron on and feed the solder into the corner between the two parts, between the iron and the component. And you can see it flowing like a liquid. You've got that nice smooth shape. You can do it again. Soldering iron on, solder in. And you can see it's flowing into the gaps and flowing around, and it's done. Now let's do one of these ones. These are quite big plugs, which means that when I solder it, the iron's going to need to stay on for a while to make it flow around. So put the iron on in a way that touches both parts. So I'm not going to just like put it on top or just touch it from the side. Make sure I'm touching the ring that I want to solder on the circuit board and the component. And I'm going to start feeding solder into the gap between the two of them. And we can start to see it flow around the actual part now. You can see the little gaps around the part filling up. At this point I can even just feed it into the component, and voila. I hope at the end there you saw it suddenly filled up the gap on its own. And you can see it flow around. Smoothly flowing around the part. Okay, now I've actually changed to a smaller soldering iron tip and turned the temperature down a bit. And that's not because it's strictly necessary for something of this size, but I want to try and slow down what's happening so you can see how the solder reacts. So we've got our pins in. Now I'm going to put the iron on as best I can so that it's touching the little pad of the circuit board and the leg of the connector. And then I'm going to feed in some solder. There you go. Heat on, solder in, and it's flowed around as a nice smooth shape. Okay, now let's look at soldering some smaller parts like this SMD op-amp. This SMD means surface mount device, meaning it doesn't go through holes in the circuit board, it just sits on top. Now you might be a little bit scared about something like this because it's so small, and yes, you can overheat them. But again, what you need to look for is when the solder flows between the two parts that you're joining. If you're watching for that, then you won't overheat it, because once it does that, you can remove the iron. But at the same time, you don't want to be so scared of overheating it that you don't actually get a proper join. Now it helps to have some tweezers to hold the part. And doing this by hand, I think, firstly, you want a reasonably small soldering iron tip. Secondly, it does help to have thinner solder. So again, I'm going to use my 0.5mm solder here. And I'm going to start by firstly checking the orientation. So I've got this little dot here, which means that's the top left usually. And I've also got a line on the top of the op-amp. Now the line always goes at the top. So top left and top, we know which way that goes. I'm going to start by just putting solder on one pad, just like that. I'm going to put the solder to one side and get my tweezers, hold the op-amp so that it's flat against the circuit board. I'm going to line it up, and now what I'm going to do is put the heat on the pad so the solder melts and slide the op-amp in. And you'll see also that as the op-amp leg warms up from touching the solder will flow onto it. And remove the iron. Now we've got one leg of the op-amp attached. So if I give it a little nudge, it can still move a little bit because it's only one leg. But this now enables us to put the tweezers down and solder the other pins. So what I'm going to do here is actually put the solder touching the leg and then touch the iron onto it and remove the solder, because you need such a small amount of solder that just the amount which melts off when you touch it is enough. You can of course do it by heating the part, feeding in some solder and removing the iron. And now that those legs are done, I'm also going to go over that first leg again, because it will get soldered nicer when you feed fresh solder into it. So now we've got those legs done, put the iron on, feed in a bit of solder and remove the iron. As you feed in the solder, you'll be able to see, if you look carefully, that it flows up the leg of the chip. Now I'm not worried at all about overheating the part here, because the iron's only on each leg for 2 to 3 seconds. But I'm not counting, I'm looking for the solder to flow. 1, 2, and off. It's done. There we are. Easy. Of course, as with many things, once you get a bit of practice, you can break the rules. Smoky. You always want to double check your work when you do it at that kind of speed.